Your blood glucose is fluctuating right now, not just when you consume sugar or refined carbohydrates, but in response to foods that most people consider healthy, safe, or even blood sugar friendly. That fluctuation is happening because certain foods contain hidden sources of rapidly absorbed carbohydrates, trigger unexpected insulin responses, or interact with your digestive system in ways that cause glucose spikes despite their reputation as wholesome choices. Your blood sugar control is not just about avoiding obvious sources of sugar like sweets and soft drinks. It is about understanding that dozens of common foods marketed as nutritious are causing the exact glucose excursions that drive insulin resistance, promote fat storage, and accelerate the development of metabolic disease. Blood sugar dysregulation is the foundational driver of nearly every chronic disease in the modern world. It does not announce itself with immediate symptoms until the damage has accumulated for years or decades, usually in the form of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or metabolic syndrome. The problem is that for decades we have been given oversimplified advice about blood sugar control. Avoid sugar, choose whole grains, eat low-fat products, and your glucose will remain stable. Except that advice has failed millions of people who followed it carefully and still developed insulin resistance and diabetes. What we are now understanding is that the glycemic impact of food depends not just on sugar content, but on processing methods, food combinations, portion sizes, and individual metabolic responses. And many foods that appear innocent or even beneficial are producing glucose spikes that rival those from pure sugar. High. I am Dr. Alex. I am an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years in AANDE, I have seen what happens when blood sugar dysregulation goes unrecognized until it manifests as diabetic emergencies, cardiovascular events, and metabolic collapse. And my goal now is to help people identify the hidden sources of glucose spikes in their diet and live longer, healthier lives. For the next several minutes, I am going to walk you through 7 foods that secretly spike your blood sugar despite being widely considered healthy or safe choices. These are not obvious junk foods. These are items that appear in standard dietary recommendations, that are marketed as nutritious options, and that most people consume regularly without realizing they are causing significant glycemic excursions that impair metabolic health. And I just want to take a few seconds here to make you a promise. I promise to keep creating the most helpful videos I possibly can, grounded in science and the latest research to help you prevent the diseases I see in the emergency department every single day. And all I ask in return is that you give this fairly new channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this video and you did not think it was worth your time, or you have not learned something new, then feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings, but if you give me your time and your attention, I will give you everything I have learned from over a decade in medicine. So please help me out. Hit the subscribe button to help me reach more people like you. And let's continue with the video. Before we discuss the 7 foods, we need to understand what actually determines how quickly and how high blood glucose rises after eating. The glycemic impact of a food is determined by several factors. First, the type of carbohydrate it contains. Simple sugars like glucose and fructose are absorbed rapidly, while complex carbohydrates require enzymatic breakdown before absorption. Second, the presence or absence of fiber, fat and protein, which slow gastric emptying and reduce the rate of glucose absorption. Third, the degree of processing and cooking, which can break down cellular structures and make carbohydrates more readily available for digestion. Fourth, the particle size, where finely ground or pureed foods produce faster glucose spikes than whole intact foods. And fifth, individual factors including insulin sensitivity, gut microbiome composition, and meal timing. What makes certain foods particularly problematic is that they are processed or prepared in ways that maximize glucose absorption while being marketed as healthy alternatives to refined sugar. The result is that people consume these foods believing they are making good choices for blood sugar control, when in fact they are causing the exact metabolic dysfunction they are trying to avoid. Food number 1 is fruit juice, even 100% pure fruit juice with no added sugar. A glass of orange juice contains approximately 26 grams of rapidly absorbed sugar, with virtually no fiber, because the juicing process has removed the pulp and cellular structure that would slow glucose absorption. When you eat a whole orange, the fiber creates a physical matrix that delays the release of sugar during digestion. Your blood glucose rises gradually over 60 to 90 minutes. When you drink orange juice, that same amount of sugar enters your bloodstream within 15 to 30 minutes because there is no fiber barrier to slow absorption. The glucose spike is nearly identical to drinking a sugar-sweetened soft drink. Research published in the British Medical Journal followed over 100,000 people for more than 20 years and found that regular consumption of fruit juice was associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, while consumption of whole fruit was associated with decreased risk. Each daily serving of fruit juice increased diabetes risk by 8%, while each daily serving of whole fruit decreased risk by 3%. The difference is entirely explained by fiber content and absorption kinetics. The natural sugars in fruit are not inherently problematic when consumed with the fiber matrix intact, but when that fiber is removed through juicing, those same sugars become metabolically identical to added sugars. Food number 2 is instant oatmeal and other quick cooking grain products. Oats are marketed as a heart-healthy whole grain that stabilizes blood sugar, and steel-cut oats do have a relatively moderate glycemic impact when prepared properly. But instant oatmeal, which is pre-cooked, dried and rolled into very thin flakes, has been processed in a way that makes the starch highly accessible to digestive enzymes. When you add hot water to instant oatmeal, the starch gelatinizes immediately and is rapidly broken down into glucose during digestion. Studies using continuous glucose monitors have shown that instant oatmeal can produce blood glucose spikes that peak at 150 to 180 milligrams per deciliter in people with normal glucose tolerance, even higher in those with insulin resistance. The glycemic index of instant oatmeal is approximately 79, which is classified as high and comparable to white bread. The same oats prepared as steel-cut oats that require 20 to 30 minutes of cooking have a glycemic index of approximately 52, which is moderate, because the larger particle size and intact structure slow digestion. The processing method, not the inherent properties of the grain itself, determines the glycemic impact. Food number 3 is dried fruit, particularly raisins, dates, and dried mango. Fresh fruit contains water that occupies volume and limits the amount of sugar you can consume in a single sitting. When fruit is dried, the water is removed, but the sugar remains concentrated. A small handful of raisins, which seems like a modest snack, contains the equivalent sugar of several whole grapes, but without the volume and fiber matrix that would create satiety and slow absorption. 30 grams of raisins, which is roughly a small box, contains approximately 22 grams of sugar and produces a rapid glucose spike, because the sugar is concentrated and the lack of volume allows you to consume far more than you would if eating whole fruit. Dates are even more problematic. A single medjool date contains approximately 16 grams of sugar, and because the texture is chewy and satisfying, people often eat 3 or 4 dates as a snack, consuming 48 to 64 grams of rapidly absorbed sugar in minutes. Research in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that dried fruit produces significantly higher glucose responses than fresh fruit when matched for total sugar content, likely because the dehydration process alters the food matrix and increases the accessibility of sugars to digestive enzymes. Dried fruit is often recommended as a healthy sweet alternative, but from a glycemic perspective, it behaves more like candy than fruit. Food number 4 is white rice, which is a staple food in many cultures but one of the most potent blood sugar elevating foods available. Rice is composed primarily of starch, which is a long chain of glucose molecules. When rice is milled to remove the bran and germ, creating white rice, it loses nearly all of its fiber and much of its protein content. What remains is almost pure starch. When you eat white rice, digestive enzymes rapidly break down that starch into glucose, causing sharp blood sugar spikes. The glycemic index of white rice ranges from 70 to 90 depending on the variety, with jasmine rice and sticky rice at the higher end. Studies in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that people who consume white rice as a staple food have significantly higher rates of type 2 diabetes compared to those who consume brown rice or other whole grains. Each daily serving of white rice increased diabetes risk by 11%, while replacing white rice with brown rice or whole grains reduced risk by 36%. The difference is explained entirely by fiber content and the rate of starch digestion. Brown rice retains the bran layer, which provides fiber and slows glucose absorption. White rice has no such barrier, allowing glucose to flood into the bloodstream within 30 to 45 minutes of eating. Food number 5 is low-fat and fat-free yogurt, particularly flavored varieties marketed as healthy breakfast or snack options. When fat is removed from yogurt to create low-fat or fat-free versions, manufacturers typically add sugar to maintain palatability, because fat provides flavor and texture. A single serving of flavored fat-free yogurt can contain 20 to 30 grams of added sugar, which is comparable to ice cream. Even plain low-fat yogurt produces a higher glycemic response than full-fat plain yogurt, because the absence of fat allows the naturally occurring milk sugar, lactose, to be absorbed more rapidly. Fat slows gastric emptying and reduces the rate at which carbohydrates enter the small intestine for absorption. When fat is removed, that buffering effect disappears. Research in the Journal of Nutrition found that full-fat dairy consumption was associated with lower rates of type 2 diabetes and better glycemic control compared to low-fat dairy, likely because the fat content moderates the insulin response and promotes satiety. The low-fat dietary recommendations that dominated nutrition guidance for decades have inadvertently created products that spike blood sugar more aggressively than their full-fat counterparts. Food number 6 is whole grain bread, even varieties marketed as high-fiber or sprouted grain. While whole grain bread is nutritionally superior to white bread in terms of micronutrient content, its glycemic impact is often surprisingly high. The issue is particle size. Modern bread production uses high-speed milling that grinds whole grains into very fine flour. Even though the bran and germ are retained, making it technically whole grain, the small particle size means digestive enzymes can access the starch very efficiently. The result is rapid starch breakdown and glucose absorption. Studies using continuous glucose monitors have shown that 2 slices of whole grain bread can produce blood glucose spikes of 140 to 160 milligrams per deciliter in people with normal glucose tolerance and substantially higher in those with insulin resistance. The glycemic index of whole grain bread ranges from 69 to 74, which is classified as high. Sprouted grain bread performs slightly better because the sprouting process breaks down some of the starch before consumption, but it still produces significant glucose elevations. The fundamental issue is that bread, regardless of whether it is made from whole grains, is a processed food where the original cellular structure of the grain has been destroyed through milling. That destruction makes the carbohydrates highly bioavailable. Food number 7 is certain breakfast cereals marketed as healthy, high-fiber options. Bran flakes, granola, and other cereals positioned as nutritious breakfast choices often contain significant amounts of added sugar and are processed in ways that increase their glycemic impact. Granola is particularly deceptive. It is marketed as a wholesome natural food, but most commercial granola is made by coating oats and nuts with sugar or honey and then baking them. A single serving, which is typically only 1/3 to 1/2 cup, can contain 12 to 18 grams of sugar. People often consume 2 to 3 times the serving size, particularly when eating granola with yogurt, resulting in 30 to 40 grams of rapidly absorbed sugar. Bran flakes are processed through extrusion, which involves cooking grain under high pressure and temperature, then shaping it into flakes. This processing gelatinizes the starch, making it more rapidly digestible. Research in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that many breakfast cereals, even those marketed as high-fiber or whole grain, produce glucose responses comparable to white bread. The glycemic index of bran flakes is approximately 74, and many granola varieties exceed 60 despite containing nuts and oats. The processing methods and added sugars overwhelm any potential benefit from fiber or whole grains. Now here is what most people misunderstand about these foods. They are not inherently toxic or forbidden. The issue is portion size, frequency of consumption, and the context in which they are eaten. A small amount of dried fruit eaten with nuts and cheese as part of a mixed meal will produce a far smaller glucose spike than a large handful eaten alone as a snack. A serving of white rice eaten with protein, vegetables, and healthy fats will have a lower glycemic impact than white rice eaten alone or with other high carbohydrate foods. The problem is that these foods are typically consumed in isolation or in combinations that maximize their glycemic impact. And they are consumed repeatedly throughout the day because people believe they are making healthy choices. Someone might have instant oatmeal with raisins and orange juice for breakfast, a granola bar mid-morning, a sandwich on whole grain bread for lunch, flavored yogurt as an afternoon snack, and white rice with dinner. Every single one of those items is marketed as healthy or acceptable, but together they are creating sustained glucose elevations throughout the day that drive insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. The consequence of repeated glucose spikes is progressive beta cell exhaustion. Each time your blood glucose rises, your pancreas releases insulin to bring it back down. When glucose spikes are frequent and large, your pancreas must produce substantial amounts of insulin repeatedly throughout the day. Over time, the cells receiving that insulin become less responsive, which is insulin resistance. Your pancreas compensates by producing even more insulin. Eventually, the beta cells that produce insulin become exhausted and begin to fail. By the time your fasting glucose rises above normal, indicating prediabetes or diabetes, you have typically lost 50 to 80% of your beta cell function. The years of glucose spikes caused by foods you believed were healthy have created irreversible pancreatic damage. So what actually prevents these hidden glucose spikes? 3 strategies. First, prioritize whole unprocessed foods where the natural food matrix remains intact. Whole fruit instead of juice. Steel-cut oats instead of instant oatmeal. Full-fat dairy instead of low-fat sweetened varieties. The physical structure of unprocessed foods slows digestion and moderates glucose absorption. Second, combine carbohydrate-containing foods with protein, fat, and fiber to slow gastric emptying and reduce the rate of glucose entry into the bloodstream. If you are going to eat rice, eat it with fatty fish and vegetables. If you are going to have yogurt, choose full-fat plain yogurt and add nuts and berries rather than buying pre-sweetened low-fat versions. Third, monitor your individual glucose response to foods using a continuous glucose monitor or fingerstick measurements. Glycemic responses vary significantly between individuals based on gut microbiome composition, insulin sensitivity, and other factors. A food that produces a modest glucose rise in one person might cause a dramatic spike in another. The only way to know how specific foods affect your blood sugar is to measure it. In emergency medicine, we see the end stage of blood sugar dysregulation when patients present with diabetic ketoacidosis, hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state, or acute cardiovascular events driven by years of uncontrolled glucose and insulin levels. When we take a dietary history, we often find that these patients were following mainstream nutritional advice. They were eating instant oatmeal for breakfast because it was marketed as heart healthy. They were drinking orange juice because it contains vitamin C. They were choosing low-fat yogurt because they were told to avoid saturated fat. They were eating whole grain bread because whole grains are supposed to be better than refined grains. Every individual choice seemed reasonable, but the cumulative glycemic load was driving progressive metabolic disease that went unrecognized until it became a medical emergency. So where does this leave you? The 7 foods we have discussed are secretly spiking your blood sugar because they are processed in ways that increase the bioavailability of carbohydrates. They are consumed in portions that exceed what your metabolism can handle, or they are marketed deceptively as blood sugar friendly when they are not. If you are regularly consuming fruit juice, instant oatmeal, dried fruit, white rice, low-fat sweetened yogurt, whole grain bread, or commercial granola, you are experiencing glucose spikes that are impairing your insulin sensitivity and accelerating the development of metabolic disease, even if your fasting glucose remains normal. The solution is not to eliminate carbohydrates entirely, which is neither necessary nor sustainable for most people. The solution is to choose carbohydrate sources that are minimally processed to consume them in appropriate portions as part of mixed meals that include protein and fat, and to monitor your individual response so you know which foods are problematic for your specific metabolism. Blood sugar control is not about following generic dietary guidelines. It is about understanding how food processing affects glucose absorption and making informed choices based on that understanding. And finally, please subscribe to the channel if you found this useful to help me reach more people like you.